ask how this whole thing got started, and I say it was a fluke. For me, at least, it was January 2000. I was courting, so to speak, a couple of elderly biologists at Cornell University with amazing stories that I wanted to tell. And anyway, the three of us were crossing a windswept parking lot, and one of us said, you know, I've got this idea. Still, none of us was thinking a cemetery startup was on our bucket list. It was more donations for memorialization, for conservation kind of scheme. Now both those gentlemen are out at Green Springs. They're pushing up daisies, which is a minor note in the annals of invasive plant biology that neither of them got to see. Those daisies are Eurasian, and I could tell you more about that later. So we'd been working for about a year on the concepts that eventually morphed into Green Springs when I heard of Billy Campbell, a country doctor in western South Carolina. He's the guy who jump-started green burial in North America in the mid-90s. Billy's family goes back 5 generations in his small town. He spent many rainy days playing among the casket displays in his family's, his chum's dad's funeral home. Then Billy went to college down in Atlanta, and he came back different. By the time he and his wife Kimberly started Ramsey Creek Preserve, he'd already put in a couple of decades of professional, high-level activism, conservation activism. He had his car windows shot out. He had his grandma's house torched. They got the wrong address. He had a friend beat up with the threat, tell Billy he's next. Then his dad died, and the family dumped an oodle in a hole in the ground, and Billy couldn't help but think how many hundreds of thousands of acres of rich habitat, beautiful places, we could save if we used just a fraction of the money spent on burials each year for conservation. I called Billy. I met him, wandered through Ramsey Creek Preserve, which is the 5-acre tobacco field, abandoned, and about 30 acres of steep wooded hillsides, and one of the most beautiful streams I've ever seen. Somebody died while I was there. I was welcome to witness the burial. And that's when I really got inspired. Roland Hughes was a coal miner's son, an ex-Marine. They were days he drank too much. Plunking down $2 or $3 grand to help restore native forests, it wouldn't have crossed his mind. But because this sometimes difficult man wanted a simple end, he did just that when he chose a traditional burial at Ramsey Creek, a wooden box, a hand-dug grave beneath a dogwood tree. Now, until about the time Roland died, Billy and Kimberly had thought the only people who'd want burial at Ramsey Creek would be environmentalists from Columbia, South Carolina, and points east. They figured they were just beta testing the concept at Ramsey Creek. Didn't think the locals would go for it, and at first they were right. But once people got used to the notion, got past the rumors, some unkind, of them throwing bodies around for the buzzards to rip into, of them dumping bodies into Ramsey Creek, past the endless jokes, you know, burying your mistakes, Billy? After all, a doctor, a country doctor who runs a cemetery on the side is going to hear them all. But once it got past that, the Baptists in their neck of the woods started burying their own at Ramsey Creek. Because you want traditional? This is it. So, like the Campbells, I'd been thinking that Green Springs would appeal mainly to your fern-sniffing tree huggers. Yet in New York's rural conservative Finger Lakes region, we've seen a similar spread. Our family and community-centered approach appeals to people across the spectrum. And Roland Hughes' story, like so many I've seen at Green Springs, tells me that the story of natural burial, what it is, how it came to be, is at heart a love story. If that seems a stretch, bear with me. Maybe it's about our love of simplicity. Simplicity, Leonardo da Vinci reputedly said, is the ultimate sophistication. For sure, simple choices, made ahead of time, are easiest on those we love and leave behind. They'll have enough to deal with as it is. Maybe it's about our love of principle. Here I'm thinking of the values that have guided us and our ancestors for lifetimes uncountable. A small example would be the convergence of Muslim and Jewish burial practices that virtually necessitate some form of green burial. Maybe it's about our love of life, of nature, the earth. And the way to continue that love story beyond the grave is quite simply to become part of the cycle of life at the end, as we were at the beginning, the way it always has been for time beyond reckoning. If you're the sort who rather likes the idea that someday part of you might become, molecules of you might become part of a berry of birdies, the violets, the mountain laurels in spring, this story is about you. Back in South Carolina, Cheryl Hughes wanted to help. So she sold the place she and Roland built when Atlanta was a much smaller burg and moved back to the hills up near Ramsey Creek. I'm strong, she told me. I can work on trails, plant trees, anything that needs doing. The Campbells had moved an abandoned church into that old tobacco field so people could hold services there or even have weddings, the way they used to during the golden years of the ex-urban cemeteries of the mid-19th century. West Laurel Hill is one. A new and visionary movement back then. So I guess I can't hang up my caulk gun and paintbrush yet, said Cheryl. She hopes her grandkids will get married there someday. And now I'm going to take a little break to run through the slides, which I was going to do earlier, and I forgot. So let's skim through them. About 2 seconds a slide. This will give you images of the things I've been talking about. That's a burial mound. And as I finish up my talk, these images will be fresh in your mind. Florida. Ramsey Creek, of course, the first. And that's a chapel, an abandoned church that they pulled down to that tobacco field. There's some amazing stories behind these burials, and you can ask me later if you want. Our first military burial. That fuzzy stuff, that's a bagpipe. The guy took a photo right through the bagpipe. That was a cold day. There's a documentary coming out about this burial. It's going to be powerful. We'll be showing it here in Philly eventually. Florida. You see, a lot of them are in the southeast. It's a burial mound. That's it. And we may as well hold there. So at Ramsey Creek, now 72 acres and growing, Kimberly and Billy are seeing a lot more involvement, seeing families spending more time with their loved ones, even after death, sitting quietly beside them before releasing them to a funeral home. Sometimes, too, morticians help families care for their dead at the funeral home. In the same vein, families who dig graves are likely to do so with the same care for the earth as they took with their loved ones during those last days of life. At Green Springs, we too have seen morticians helping families wash and shroud and look after their dead. We've seen families, friends, entire communities, 100, 300, 500 people, a charter bus out of Philly, come together to grieve and care for their beloved dead that they are committing to the earth with such warmth and tenderness, even when it's bitter cold. So by now you might have gathered that in calling this a love story, I'm not sugarcoating death. And as with all great stories, this story has so many faces, so many meanings, that it can't help but be way bigger than we are, which is partly why we find it so compelling, especially when we take that last metaphoric leap, framing our choices in death as an expression of our choices in life. Our last gift, our last gesture, is a gift that ripples down the generations. And now when Cheryl Hughes is gardening or watching TV or whatever, and her mind drifts suddenly and she hears unbidden that solid thunk, those clods of red Carolina clay sliding off her shovel and scattering the 33 yellow roses she placed in Roland's grave. He won't be so far away. Thank you.
How does your methodology or movement or whatever feel about in relation to cremation? Does that have a relationship to this stuff here?
You know, before I fell into this, as it were, I thought that I would be cremated, and I did some digging, as it were. And the ecological costs of cremation, it turns out, we aren't sure yet. We haven't done enough research, but it's certainly, I would guess, more or less equivalent to a contemporary burial with the rainforest hardwood, the caskets maybe being shipped in from overseas, the synthetic liners, the vaults, producing and shipping vaults. Cremation is probably more or less equivalent to that, but we just don't have enough data yet to say.
Without that mechanical lowering device and so forth, how is the grave dug? Is it dug by people power, or how is it lowered? How is that managed?
Did you all hear that? How, you heard or didn't?
Repeat it?
Sure. So minus a mechanical lowering device, et cetera, how do people dig graves? People power.